Dear ambassadors, dear Mr. Saito, Mr. Bregman, dear guests, friends of the EU, thank you for being in this room and with us online via YouTube. I believe there are about 300 more people watching this session to the opening session of our 2022 European Literature Festival. The opening session tonight is a conversation between two authors, Mr. Kohei Saito, Mr. Rutger Bregman. Based on their recent writings and books, they will address the question, how do we restore trust in politics? What does it take to save democracy in a capitalist world? The dialogue will be moderated by our ambassador, Mr. Jean-Éric Paquet. So thank you for being with us today. Just to mention that those of you in the room, we have the interpretation on channel 1 in English. The entire dialogue will be in English, so if you'd like to listen in Japanese, please use the channel 2 interpreters. 日本語で聞かれる方は、レシーバーの Those of you who wish to listen in Japanese, please use channel 2. Online, you have a choice between the Japanese channel or the English channel. Please find the right one. They should both be sent to you with your registration. Thank you. So now I would like to ask Ambassador Paquet to introduce our two speakers and begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And welcome to all of you to the European Literature Festival 2022. Welcome to you here in the room, and welcome indeed to the many of you following us online. We are kicking off this evening with, for me, a particularly important panel, one which I've been waiting for now for at least a month, preparing myself by reading you, Rutger. This is a book which I think some of you here in the room and some of you online will have read. I bought it 6 months or 8 months ago, and it was on my bedside. And I now, at long last, was able to go through it. And it paints a remarkable story of sociology, politics, economics, getting it essentially wrong about who we are as human beings, and deconstructing all of these stories which are set up around homo economicus as a rational actor, a selfish actor, and you make the case for what is good in man and which brings us all together. But you will explain it. I will not go into it now. I would have loved, Kohei, to say that I wrote your book, but your book is available right now in Japanese, and my limits of Japanese are such that I couldn't read it. I had a look at your work as academic, and I'm very much looking forward to the English version of Capital in the Anthropocene. We briefly discussed it. You are trying to make the case that today's, or the traditional political economy, the neoliberal political economy probably particularly, but capitalism more generally is depleting our resources, and alongside other economic thinkers today, you are making the case that we need to transform as societies. So when I came to Japan a few weeks ago, and I will stop with that, one question I had is, where will I find the Japanese Greta Thunberg, which is moving Japan's society into this transformation? Maybe I found Greta with Kohei, but he will tell you, of course, modestly, that it's not the case. And it's of course true also that Greta is very much about activism in society. It will no doubt be part of our conversation. The two of you have met already online in January, and this was a particularly interesting conversation, which was also recorded in Bungei Shunju magazine in the May issue. I would like to refer you to that as well. It's particularly interesting to read. We have a working English translation for those of you interested. And from that, I realized that you don't need a moderator. You got going, and I think I'm going to have a very easy and maybe very difficult task. We'll see. But I want to. I don't want to speak much more, and I would like to ask you, Rutger, to kick it off with maybe the gist of your findings and how you think they are relevant, and how maybe your conversation can continue 1 year later, or nearly 1 year later, with the war in Ukraine. Is this putting into question your findings?
Sure. Well, let me first thank you for the invitation tonight. I find it such a fantastic opportunity to finally speak to Kohei. I think it's also really important to emphasize that I think your work is very courageous. What you're doing here in Japan. You dare to ask so many important questions that need to be discussed right now. Sometimes people say that some of your ideas, or maybe some of my ideas, are utopian, that they will never happen, that they're too radical, you know, that they disturb the status quo. But if you think that we can hold on to the status quo, if you think that we can keep going on like this as a species, as humanity, then you're really delusional. So maybe you don't agree with all the ideas discussed here tonight, maybe you don't agree with all my ideas or Kohei ideas, but it's incredibly important to remember that we need to be discussing these ideas, because the status quo is simply unsustainable. That's what the science tells us. So yeah, I just want to share my admiration. I think it's very courageous and important what you're doing here in Japan. Maybe say one short thing about the current situation we're in right now in Europe. Obviously, a terrible war has broken out, and for me, what it's made me realize once again is just how incredibly precious and important democracy is. Freedom of speech, freedom of association. I spent the last 1.5 years studying the abolitionist movement, you know, the fight against slavery. It originated in the 18th century in Britain. A very small group of thoughtful, committed citizens who dared to risk their reputations or even their lives in the fight against one of the greatest crimes that humanity has ever committed. Back then, we got to remember, around 1800, you know, 3/4 of the world population was some kind of slave, you know, so freedom was really the exception back then. And one of the reasons why abolitionism took off, not the only reason, but really prerequisite at the time, was that in Britain there was broad freedom of speech. So people were able to discuss ideas that may, you know, seem abhorrent. Many people thought it was foolish to think that we could abolish slavery. They thought, you know, it would wreck the economy, it would be dangerous, etc. But it's so important for progress in society that we are willing to discuss ideas that we may not initially like, or that may even make us a little bit uncomfortable, right? So we gotta be comfortable with uncomfortableness, right? That's, I think, really important. And that's something that has made me realize once again that without democracy, without freedom of speech, without the freedom to think, we're lost. And that's very clear right now in Europe. That's what the brave Ukrainians are fighting for, and I think they deserve all our support. So maybe that as a first remark.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm very also happy to see you in Japan. It's been such a wonderful conversation last time in January, and we are very happy to continue that conversation today further. But I also want to emphasize that, as Rutoga just said, that how important actually the utopia is. You know what? I feel today a little bit uncomfortable here as a Marxist to be the opening event of this important European Literature Festival. Who could imagine that, you know, as you know, Japan is a relatively conservative society. It's a democratic country, but conservative. And now, I, as a Marxist, and I even advocate for degrowth kind of economy, wrote a book on degrowth communism, and that book became very popular in Japan, selling almost 500,000 copies. And of course, many people react, okay, capitalism is in crisis, we are heading towards a very dangerous state of the climate emergency, but communism is not possible, degrowth is not possible. But then, if we simply go back to the normal daily life, we keep continuing consuming fossil fuels and changing this planet. And I think we still need to posit an ideal that is radically different from today. Otherwise, any kind of transition is not possible. So bringing about this or discussing the possibility of new society is more important than ever today. And today, I think from the side of degrowth communism or from the side of the more different kinds of post-capitalist or capitalist society, I think we can have a very meaningful conversation today. And by questioning, so one important point that has changed since our last conversation is, as Pickett mentioned, the war. I think many readers wonder, after reading your book, Humankind, why this kind of war happens. If humans are good by nature, why are we experiencing this kind of disastrous tragedy now in Europe? Mm-hmm. Could you a little bit explain why always bad things happen?
Yeah, sure. So that's obviously one of the questions you have to face if you write a book about human decency, is why is there so much tragedy and why are there so many atrocities, in all of human history? And it's not like that the war in Ukraine is like a revolutionary new data point, right? It's the 20th century in Europe is especially the first half was a very, very dark century. So the shortest summary of my book would be something like, most people are pretty decent, but power corrupts. In the prologue, I talk about this moment in the beginning of the Second World War, when the Nazis had the idea that if they would just start bombing the British people, that they would be able to destroy the British morale. Because they thought, British people or people in general are just very selfish. They will quickly panic. And once the bombs will start falling out of the sky, it will be very easy for us. That was the theory. It was a specific theory that Adolf Hitler and other people in the German army had. Now, what happened once the bombs started falling was pretty much the opposite. The British called it the keep calm and carry on spirit, the blitz spirit. And there were all kinds of wonderful anecdotes about what happened. So there were, for example, pubs that were almost completely destroyed that had signs outside which said, more open than usual. And it was really fascinating. If you look at some of the numbers, actually production increased. And it seemed actually to strengthen the morale and the spirit of the British people. Now, in 1942, 1943, obviously the tide was turning in the war. And then the British had to face the question, okay, what are we going to do with our fleet of bombers? Are we going to bomb mainly, industry, focus on those kind of targets, or are we going to bomb cities and focus on civilians? Now, what the British thought is that, of course, it didn't work when they started bombing us, but the Germans, well, we all know the Germans, they're so weak, right? They're such a weak moral character. If we just start bombing them, we'll be able to completely break their morale. And that's what they did. Actually, 10 times as many bombs fell on German cities as on British cities. It was really an enormous destruction, an enormous wreckage. And then later, after the war, British and American economists tried to answer the question, was this actually effective? And there was one economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, who called this the greatest miscalculation in the whole war. Because they found out that actually the cities that were bombed the heaviest actually saw increased warfare production. So again, the same thing happened. It was actually something that strengthened the German morale. It brought them together. So the same mistake was being made again and again and again. Now, what have we seen? It's a long story, I'm sorry, but what have we seen in this war in Ukraine? Exactly the same thing once again. So what did Vladimir Putin think? He thought that he could just, walk over the Ukrainian country. He thought it wasn't a real country, it wasn't a real people, and that once they would start bombing Kiev and other places, that he would be able to quickly break their spirit. We have seen the opposite happening. So it's fascinating to see, and obviously very tragic and disturbing as well, to see history repeating in that way. Look, I don't think there are simple explanations for such complex phenomena as war. In the book, I only push back against the idea that it is deeply in our nature. There are all kinds of mechanisms that can push us towards all kinds of terrible behaviors. I think the distance, for example, is very important. Psychologically, it's much easier to, say, push a button on an artillery device and kill a lot of people far away than it is to really look someone in the eye and pull the trigger. And sadly, modern technology has given us a lot of means to cause a lot of havoc. But for me, it's essential to start with the recognition that this is not deep down who we are and what we want as a species. And also, the history teaches us that warfare is a relatively recent invention. So for the biggest part of our history, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. And there's no evidence that back then we engaged in warfare. It really originated with the rise of, well, what we call civilization and agriculture and living in a sedentary way.
I actually remember about you discussed about Kameradschaft.
Yeah.
So the basic idea is you become cruel against enemies in order to protect your friends or families and so on.
Yeah, it's a form of social conformity, right?
Right. So, I mean, that's why there's a dilemma, right? Even if you are good by nature, you become cruel because of the aggression from the outside. And this aggression was actually caused by some crazy dictators like Hitler or currently by other politicians. But the problem here is if we have those crazy leaders or populists who order those kind of aggressive attacks against enemies, then the war begins, even if we are good, even if we are good by nature. And I think that what I see currently in the same problem today is those people who are extremely rich, like 0.1% super rich people, also become very aggressive against other people. They lost the imagination about other people. They forget how other people are living in the current situation, especially during the time of pandemic or during the time of the war. And they accumulate even more wealth, as Piketty recently showed. And they consume private jets, they have gigantic houses and so on. And in the similar way as we need a regulation against those crazy political leaders who ignore human rights and so on, don't we need a kind of strong regulation to those super rich who behave as if they own the entire planet?
Yeah. So I was in Davos in 2019, where the rich of the world meet to congratulate themselves on how awesome they are. And for some reason, they haven't invited me again.
Never.
But what's interesting is that if you go there, some people may think, oh, all these global elites, they're so selfish, and they're so arrogant. But actually, the opposite is true. Many people there are very nice, very warm, very friendly. I remember that at one point they were screening David Attenborough's new movie, that's now on Netflix, Our Planet. And a lot of people were watching it, and actually quite a few people were crying in the audience, how we're wrecking the planet. And I was looking at that, and I was thinking, like, but you guys are doing it, right? You're like the main responsibility here. You arrived here in your 1,500 private jets. So that is, I guess, the tragedy, is that we often think that human evil comes from people who are sort of evil deep down or really know that. Like we watch the Batman movies where the villain is the Joker, right? And the Joker just enjoys being a bad guy. He enjoys hurting other people. But that's not how evil operates in our world. It's mostly, it operates by seducing people and by making them blind to what they're doing. And that is a sad truth. What we then need, and I'm curious how you think about this, humans very much want to be liked, right? And this is our strength, but also our weakness. We desperately want to be part of a group, right? This social conformity is really in our DNA. And maybe it's even culturally enhanced, in particular in Japanese society, where it's very, you pay a price for being different. You pay a price for standing out of the group, right? So what we sometimes actually need is what these abolitionists did, that I mentioned at the end of the 18th century, or what the suffragettes did in the 19th century when they fought for the women's right to vote. They had the courage to be different and to be weird and to be an outcast. And they paid a heavy price for it, right? Very often they didn't experience success in their lifetime. But is that what's necessary here in Japan today as well? More people who are willing to stand out and to be a bit more uncomfortable? What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that that attitude of being courageous, not being afraid of being categorized as weird, is something that what we absolutely need in the time of ecological crisis. So for example, people like Greta Thunberg are really courageous in that sense. And what she began really changed the whole paradigm or framework of our thinking towards the issue of climate crisis. But compared to that, so the reason why I'm criticizing green growth and advocating degrowth and even degrowth communism is that exactly why connected to this point. For example, if you can simply invest in electronic vehicles or renewable energies and grow your economy and accumulate more wealth, you're not challenging anything. You're basically simply continuing investing in the market for the sake of making profit, and then you feel less bad because you're doing something good for the environment. But that's not something what we are actually required to do in times of crisis. Remember the time of pandemic, for example. During the pandemic, we did lockdowns and we did strong market intervention by the state in order to protect people's life, right? But that was accompanied by those measures that were regarded as ultimately impossible before the pandemic. But we could do it because some politicians, some scientists advocated to do this. And they said it's necessary. And something similar I think we need to do in terms of ecological crisis. And that's why I wrote this book, Capital in the Anthropocene, knowing, of course, being aware that this slogan, degrowth communism, is not easily accepted by the mass media or newspapers and other colleagues, academics. But and also, I got many responses, why Marx today? The Soviet Union failed and so on. But at the same time, especially the younger generation reacted in a different way. Or even the workers in the big companies from the SDGs section. SDGs are very popular, as you know, in Japan. But they actually know during their work, what they're doing is basically meaningless compared to the tasks that they have today. So even those people who are having the important job in the big companies read my book, and they secretly told me that they actually completely agree with me. But they still don't know how they could make this kind of bold transition to a new system. And I still cannot describe a concrete path. It's not something I guess a philosopher can do, that making the detailed policies in terms of the decarbonization and the transition to a more post-capitalist society. But I'm very happy that many people are actually reacting positively to these kind of weird ideas, even in Japan.
Yeah, yeah. If I can be a little bit provocative, maybe as an outsider, you will give me that opportunity. The first thing I thought 5 years ago when I first visited Japan was just how many socially useless jobs I saw. So there's this concept from David Graeber. He's an anthropologist. He actually has a scientific term for this. Not sure if I'm allowed to say it, but it has appeared in an academic journal. So he calls it bullshit jobs. And the definition of a job like that is that the person who has the job thinks that he or she doesn't really add anything of value to society. And actually already when I arrived at the airport this Saturday, I saw so many people doing jobs. I thought, like, is that a job actually, right? Someone was standing next to a little stair, like with just 5 steps, like a little bit higher than this, with an iPad, and it said like stair, like watch out, there's a stair here. I was like, yeah, I saw that. That's not, I didn't need that. Just a sign would have been enough, or maybe not even that. And then it seems to me that if you have such a strong obsession with work, right, that if work becomes the essence of your identity, that everyone needs to have a job, then it just becomes very difficult to achieve any kind of societal change, right? So I was wondering what you would mean in practice with degrowth. What are we going to degrow, right? Would it be those kind of jobs, or are you mainly thinking about consumption, like less SUVs or less, I don't know. What is it going to look like in practice?
I think one of the reasons why this call for degrowth has become quite popular in Japan is, as I said, because of the experience during the pandemic. We actually knew quite clearly, or we came to realize quite clearly, what kind of jobs are actually simply bullshit jobs, and what kind of jobs are essential work. And obviously, nursing and other kind of care works, education, and those things are quite essential. But, for example, advertisement, consulting, financial markets, they are not protecting us from the virus. But the one who are making money are basically bullshit jobs. And that's why David Graeber's book has become quite popular in Japan too. And what should we eliminate for the degrowth society? Of course, I'm not advocating eliminating everything, degrowing everything. Simply scaling down some of those bullshit economies can actually even enhance our quality of life without damaging well-being of society. And we have more people working in the essential sectors, and we can pay more money to them. So concretely, for example, we can ban private jets, we can ban cruise ships, we can ban SUVs, and we can also reduce domestic flights. We can also reduce advertisement. I'm not saying that all advertisements are bad, but some of
For your books, that's acceptable, right?
But for example, I recently read about an article that in a Dutch city, they banned advertisement on meat.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
that kind of transition can be achieved even within capitalism, but they can have a significant impact on how we perceive commodities, how we perceive the world, and then how we behave in this society.
Yes. Maybe that's something I also like to emphasize, is that even within two societies that are both capitalist, right? Japan is a capitalist economy, the Netherlands, where I'm from, is capitalist as well, but still there are huge differences. So you probably have the longest working week in the world, while we actually have the shortest working week in the world, right? People work, what is it, on average 30, 35 hours maybe in the Netherlands.
And we work like 70, 80 hours.
Yeah. Well, I was recently having dinner with my publisher, and the editor-in-chief said, well, usually today I go home earlier. And I said, well, what time? And he said 7. Like, 7? That's very late. So, yeah, there seems to be quite some room for change, even within a market economy. Yeah.
This brings me to one key question. I mean, you said it's not for philosophers or thinkers to lay out the path of these transformations. You are thinking the unthinkable and pushing actors to then change. You're making the case, I think, in both your work that society needs to be pushed towards transformation. So where are the tipping points in society to achieve change, and how can you mobilize communities, and maybe in a pragmatic bottom-up way? You have quite a few examples in your book which I find really interesting about urban communities or regional communities really achieving change in a rather pragmatic bottom-up way, including in the transformations which you are recommending.
So there's this quote from the anthropologist Margaret Mead that I've always loved. She says, "We should never underestimate the power of small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." Now, usually this quote is used by left-wing idealists to say, "Yeah, we can change the world, right? If only we come together." And it sounds like very, very happy and warm and nice. But if you really think about what she's saying there, it's quite brutal. She's saying it's small groups of thoughtful, committed people who change the world, and that only they do it. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. So that means, by definition, that the vast majority of people don't change the world. The vast majority of people just live their lives. But because the vast majority of people just live their lives, the potential, even for individuals or small groups, to change society is enormous, right? It's a little bit like if you have an oil tanker and you just have a little bit of force, right? You just try to change it, make it change course a little bit, then it ends up in a completely different place, right? So that is what I often see in history. These small groups, whether they're the abolitionists or the suffragettes, or sometimes, you know, for worse. I mean, if you study the history of Germany in the 1920s, for example, it was a very small group around Adolf Hitler who in the end managed to grab power. But that's what history tells us. It very often starts with these small groups of committed people. There's some research that maybe you were referring to by Erica Chenoweth, who studied revolutions, and she's built a huge database that show that you need to often reach a certain threshold, and then you can start changing society. You write about this as well, right? What was the number? 3.5?
3.5.
Yeah.
And 3.5 is quite small compared to what we usually believe as a tipping point for changing societies. Especially in democracy, we need at least 50%. But that's not how society radically changes. According to Erica Chenoweth, it's only 3.5. Arab Springs and other people's revolution, and those things are conducted by a small number of people who risked their lives in order to bring a change. But I want to add, that's only possible only when the majority of people are open to those ideas. Mm-hmm. And for example, recently I wrote an article about Just Stop Oil, the tomato soup on Goethe's painting. And I think the reaction to that action is very different in Europe and in Japan.
So can you describe what happened?
Yeah, I wrote in my article, okay, this act is kind of stupid, but we need to question why those people do this. What's the demand that they're making? And we actually have to imagine why those people are so desperate about climate change. And then, as far as I know, European people at least start to discuss about climate change in the medias and newspapers and so on. But in Japan, simply we reacted as a kind of eco-terrorism, and we simply shut down, asking that kind of question, why do Just Stop Oil cause this kind of disruption? And Japanese society is very reluctant to see this kind of disruption as a kind of advocation for thinking about those new ideas. So in Japan, I think this 3.5% is a little bit different. In Europe, the 3.5% group of tiny people create this kind of radical disruption, and then the majority of people try to learn from them. They can criticize, of course, but still they change the framework of how they perceive the world, and that's how new paradigm emerges. But in Japan, people still don't change this framework. Mm-hmm. They only see the action of disruption from the stable framework, mm-hmm. and then nothing happens. Mm-hmm. I think that creates, in the long term, strong, like a very massive difference in terms of the future path. Mm-hmm. Japan might remain where we are right now, but other societies might advance due to those disruption actions. So I'm afraid of that. Yeah.
So there's a psychologist called Cass Sunstein who recently published a book with the title How Change Happens. It's a very fascinating theory of basically how societies change. And he introduces a couple of concepts. The first one is preference falsification. People have a lot of beliefs that they don't show. Maybe one example here would be, well, let's ask a question. Who in this audience, please raise your hand, who in this audience thinks that wearing a mask right now makes you safer, right? Is important for your own personal safety? Does anyone think that? There's one person. And the vast majority doesn't believe it doesn't make you any safer. Well, that's interesting, right? So this is what we call preference falsification. You actually don't believe in the usefulness of the mask, at least most of you, but you still wear one. And that's, I think, a result of social conformity, right? It's not actually required by law, but still most of you do it. This happens very often in societies. So Cass Sunstein gives the example from Saudi Arabia, where most men actually think that their wives should be allowed to work. But then they think that all the other men don't think the opposite. And so the result politically is that, you know, there's even in polls, there's very little support for giving women the right to work. This is also the reasons why revolutions can sometimes take up very quickly. Because what happens during revolutions is that suddenly people realize, hey, wait a minute, I'm not alone. I wasn't the only one who really hates working 80 hours a week. I'm not the only one who really thinks it's silly to wear masks outside when there's no scientific evidence whatsoever that that works. So that's what happens during these kind of moments. Now, we all have different action thresholds. This is another concept from the psychology. Some people don't need any kind of social support before they do something, right? They just follow their own ideals. There were some, you know, resistance heroes, for example, during the Second World War. They didn't need any kind of encouragement, and they just did the right thing. So in the Netherlands, we have wonderful examples, very few, sadly, but some examples of people who immediately realized, we got to help the Jews and give them a place to hide. The vast majority of people, though, have a higher action threshold. So you've got the zeros, they don't need any, but you've also got the ones. They need to see just one other person taking off their mask, and then they're like, oh, well, maybe I can do it then as well. This happened with us just now. I saw you were not wearing a mask, and I thought, okay, you know, don't have to do it either. Then most people are not a one. Like you've got the 3s, you've got the 5, you've got the 10s. And we all have our different thresholds. Now, revolutions take off, right, when there's a cascade effect. When the 1s mobilize the 2s, and the 2s mobilize the 4s, etc., and it goes on and on and on like that. And sometimes societies are stuck because you don't have enough zeros, or not enough 5s, or not enough 10s, etc., etc. And this also explains why sometimes revolutions can take off so quickly, because people, as I said, realize that, hey, I wasn't the only one. And I'm curious what you think here, but my feeling is that with the enormous success of your book, I mean, 500,000 copies of a book written by a Marxist philosopher, I mean, that is
pretty insane.
Yeah, that is pretty insane. So I think that there's an enormous amount of preference falsification going on in Japan, that a lot of, especially young Japanese people, have very different views than what maybe they say outside, you know, or say in public. And that suggests to me that there's much more potential for social change than maybe you think. But I'm curious if you agree or whether that's wishful thinking.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your wonderful comments. I think this is true. I think many people in Japan are simply not happy about the current economy. They don't think that the current way of capitalism would go on in terms of population, in terms of their own companies, in terms of their climate crisis and so on. So people actually know that it's not going well if we continue business as usual. Mm-hmm. But they simply do this because they believe that they don't have any other choice. But I think as they read my book, they actually realize, oh, this might not be the case. And then they are actually quite excited about this. But I think the same thing is also happening outside Japan. And I don't think you are believing that, you know, simply investing in renewable energies or electric vehicles will save us from the current climate crisis. We need a much deeper transformation. And when many people actually explicitly open this kind of ideas, I think someone like Greta Thunberg needs to start this, but this process will accelerate. So degrowth, I would say, is not a complete utopia. I think this is it's still a utopia, and it will be utopia for a long time. But at the same time, the popularity of the concept of degrowth in Europe or in other parts of the world is not coincidence. People are actually losing their confidence in capitalism. So I also want to ask, what's your evaluation of this kind of popularity of degrowth? Do you think that capitalism will save us from the climate crisis, or do you also think that we need a kind of radical transformation, including this economic system, capitalism, from capitalism to degrowth kind of society?
So, to be honest, I have very conflicted views on degrowth. On the one hand, I see an enormous potential to get rid of a lot of bullshit. Whether that's in the job market or in the kind of things we consume. I think SUVs should really be made illegal. It's really a plague on the whole on the world. I completely agree with your views on advertisement. It's very weird that we've gotten used to this idea that advertisement needs to be everywhere in the public space. That wasn't the case in the past, and I think we should reclaim our commons in that respect. So I have quite some sympathy for degrowth there. But to be honest, as a political slogan, I think degrowth is terrible. Because it's very hard to win elections by saying, vote for me, I'll give you less, right? Usually it's much better to say, vote for me, I'll give you more, or I'll make you happy, or I'll make you rich or prosperous or whatever. So for me, I think we still have to try and redefine what growth is. I recently became a father. My daughter is now 1.5, and I'm very happy to see her growing. So for me, growth in some cases has some very positive connotations.
But she doesn't grow infinitely, right?
Exactly, exactly. If she was 30 years old and if I was still growing, I would be disturbed, right? So sure, there are limits. But I think humanity has still so much potential, and also technological potential. So for example, if you look at the enormous innovation in solar energy or wind energy, which is, by the way, we can thank the Europeans for that. We've really led the way in innovating with the Germans with solar energy and the Spanish as well, and wind energy, obviously, mainly the Danish. But those were things that didn't exist like 15 years ago. We didn't have cheap solar energy. We didn't have cheap wind energy. So if you would have been advocating degrowth back then, yeah, I think that would have been problematic. And still, there are a lot of new technologies that I wish would exist. So for example, today, globally, we slaughter 80 billion animals. And that is, I think, an enormous crime. I think the historians of the future will be horrified by the way we treat animals today. But it is also technologically absolutely ridiculous. So, for example, for 1 kilogram of beef, you need to feed 25 kilograms of animal feed to a cow. So the cow is a very inefficient technology. And I am super excited by new innovations right now in the lab. Clean meat, for example, or precision fermentation. It's what you really see happening now is a protein revolution, is that we will be able to get much healthier, much more tasty, and cheaper proteins. And I think there's just a lot of innovation necessary there. And I would call that growth, right? That for me, maybe you say, okay, well, that also exists under degrowth, but I think that for the average citizen, that's sort of hard to grasp, right? So I would say degrowth in some domains, but a new kind of growth in other domains.
If you allow me, I think indeed, I think we need to redefine the instruments of political economy. I think it's not so much the label of degrowth, but how we measure indeed wealth in our societies in terms of well-being, in terms of education, in terms of social inclusion, in terms of health, not just in terms of material accumulation. I think on that, there's a lot of there are very positive and intense conversations happening in Europe along these lines. Can we check if this resonates a little bit what your fascinating conversation in the audience or maybe online? I don't know if we have already some reactions or comments online, but let me start with the room as you are here with us. Does anyone wish to come in and tell us about his or her own experience in changing or seeing change around him, tipping points, how we need to engage as citizens or human beings rather, homo puppy, as you put it in your remarkable analysis.
We have a microphone, so if you raise your hand.
And online? Okay, well, I think let's continue. And yeah, back to the political economy. I think this is what I'm so interested in your own work, and looking forward to read you in English, is indeed that we have a number of dogmas, instruments of measurement, including GDP growth in particular, which of course also have real implications in terms of public finance management. So that's something which is not so easy to change. So how do you see that conversation going beyond degrowth? And another discussion which you have now started on tipping points, and you're a sociologist, really interests me. I'd be really keen to look at it. I mean, there are of course other examples like smoking in public places, or smoking altogether. I mean, this was the absolute norm everywhere, and at some point it turned really immediately, when there was indeed a threshold in society of people who started finding this unacceptable, not just for themselves, but for their surroundings. So how do we move society beyond technology, which will get us quite some way, but how do we really transform as societies? That, I think, is really the conversation you're having. And I think in your book you're making a few examples in Latin America, also in Europe, where politicians turn to society to help them make the right choices. Can you say a bit
Yes,
on that?
absolutely. So what we've seen in the last couple of decades is truly a revolution in the way some countries and cities practice democracy. So our standard definition of democracy is that we have politicians, career politicians, right? We have other people who represent us and who represent our interests. And we vote every 4 years or so, and then we hope for the best. That is a pretty shallow idea of what a democracy could be. I mean, democracy, if we go back to the original Greek meaning of the word, is rule of the people, right? And if we look at the first democracy, or one of the first democracies, the classic Greek democracy, it was very much the opposite of what we have today. So what the Greeks did is they randomly selected citizens from the population to be a politician for a year, or maybe for a little bit longer, but that was the practice. Actually, the Greeks thought that elections were very undemocratic, because it's easy to manipulate elections, and you can just, buy a seat or something like that. So that for them, randomly selecting from the people from the population was much more rational. And there are many places who are now experimenting with these kind of things. There's also the whole the new idea of participatory budgeting. This is what cities do. They have a significant budget, and they ask citizens, okay, where do you want to spend it on? And everyone is free to come and participate. Many people think, oh, this would never work, right? The citizens are too stupid, they're too lazy, they wouldn't come, etc., etc. But there are many, many hopeful experiments, actually. It really started in Latin America, this movement, but now it's expanding across the globe. By one count, there are 1,500 cities in the whole world who are doing it, one form of participatory budgeting. I think sometimes these experiments are too small. Sometimes they're more PR, for the local politicians. They're more like a theater show or something like that. But there are also some really, really hopeful examples that if you actually treat your citizens as adults, then they will start behaving as adults. If you treat them like idiots, then they behave like idiots, obviously. So I'm quite hopeful about that. But you write a little bit about that as well, right? And about
Barcelona and the municipalism. And I'm quite optimistic about that kind of a new form of the self-governance emerging in Europe. And in Spain, you have a the Ministry of the Consumption, whose name is Albert Garzón. He is actually advocating degrowth. And he's the top of the left-wing group, and I'm going to Spain to host a conference on degrowth with him next year or something like that. So there's a really political movement emerging, and the younger generations are more open to those ideas that older generation might not simply accept. But I think in 10, 15 years, there's a strong hope that political landscape will be something really different, because we are entering into a much more severe conditions of living as the climate crisis will continue to worsen in the next decades. And here, I think that answering to your question, I think what we need is really redefine the measurement of our economy. Instead of simply using GDPs, which is invented like 100 years ago by Kuznets, in order to legitimate the US supremacy over other countries. But GDP only measures very one-sided aspect of our production and consumption and what is actually necessary for living and so on. So why don't we or European unions or Japan come up with a new measure of economy that not simply measures GDP, but also environmental impacts and also human well-being or societal well-being. And these measures actually kind of exist already, like Human Progress Index and GPIs and Genuine Progress Indicators are examples. And if you look at those indicators, US is not #1 of the world. They are like 10 or 11th. And European countries like Sweden and other countries come to much higher, like #1. So it's just how we see the world. If we simply look at GDP, America becomes #1. But if we look at other aspects, we can be much happier, even in Japan or even in the EU. And there's a chance that using that kind of indicators, we can have we can create a much more room for introducing the idea of degrowth into concrete political measures and the policies.
Yeah, I agree. And that's actually quite, I mean, you could maybe say a bit more about that than I do, but that's already quite mainstream right now on the European discussion. I think a couple of years ago there was a big commission. Didn't the French do that? Like a few top economists who were coming up with new measures. To me, I think that GDP is still, it's still a tool that you can use, and it strikes me that quite often also these new indicators correlate quite a bit with GDP. So in general, you'd prefer to be rich as a country instead of being poor. And there are also other things like, for example, women's rights or even democracy or other things also tend to correlate pretty well with GDP, unless your wealth comes from oil, obviously. If it's from fossil fuels, then it doesn't correlate. But I was wondering how you look at the current, basically the tension that we're in right now. So on the one hand, we advocate for quite radical changes. But history also teaches us that radical changes take a lot of time. So for example, if you look at the abolitionist movement, before the first abolitionists stood up in, the 70-20s, 70-30s in the US, radical abolitionists like Benjamin Lay, for example, and it took, at least 2 centuries or something like that, or even longer than that. Countries like, if I remember correctly, Mauritania or some other countries, only recently actually legally abolished slavery. And as we hopefully all know, there are still forms of slavery that exist today. I mean, if you're watching the World Cup today, I mean, those stadiums were built by people who were like almost technically slaves. So it takes so much time to change the world. The fight for the women's rights in the US, it took like a century, 4 generations. I believe in the possibility of radical change, but as a historian, I also am realistic, and I know that things just take time, right? There's a saying in science that science progresses one funeral at a time. And this is also true in politics often, right? Is that people often don't change after the age of 30, right? Societies often get stuck. And maybe this is particularly the case in Japan, which is a gerontocracy, right? The old people rule. There are just more of them. And that sometimes makes me pessimistic, because if we look at climate change, we're on such a tight timeline, right? We need to halve emissions by 2030, which is, what is it, like 7 years and a couple of weeks away now, and move to zero emissions, by 2050 and probably earlier. That is, I mean, the challenge is enormous. It's never been done before in peacetime. I know of no historical analogy. Some people point to war mobilizations. Well, I think that's a very different kind of situation, and that was, pretty tough process. That was very top-down, not very democratic. So sometimes I really worry that things will have to get much worse before people finally wake up. And that is quite terrifying, isn't it? Because if you look at what the science is telling us, 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees, maybe it sounds abstract, but the reality is absolutely horrifying. Lots and lots of people will die. Ecosystems will die. My own country is meters below sea level, right? So the lowest point in the Netherlands is 7 meters below sea level. The very existence of my country is at stake here. We're rich. We can protect ourselves for quite a while. So I think we can handle, I've interviewed quite a few scientists about this. We should be able to handle 2, 3, perhaps 4 meters of sea level rise. But at some point, we'll have to go to Germany. And I'm not looking forward to that. So I was wondering how you think about that. Is that we are on such a tight timeline?
I would say that's exactly why we need an idea of utopia more than ever. I'm not that optimistic. I think we will be in the time of chronic emergency due to war, pandemic, and climate crisis that will continue to worsen the inequality, poverty, hungers, and our quality of life, and endangers our life. So that's quite dangerous. And if we remember the COP27, there is almost no progress. A little bit about loss and damage, but generally, we don't have any hope about achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. We have to admit this. We will probably exceed 1.5, even 2 degrees Celsius. So this will be a complete disaster for the planet and our societies. If we give up, however, if we give up any hope of transformation, if we simply become passive, there will be much worse form of war, discrimination, and violence and so on. That's not something what we can simply let them happen. We need to build a much stronger form of democracy, solidarity, and association in order to fight against those backlashes, which will come for sure. So even if we cannot avoid the catastrophe, we still need to strive for achieving utopia more than ever. So that's the paradox. We know that something bad is happening and coming, but that's why we need to even make more efforts toward utopia.
Yeah,
yes,
I would say
yes.
that radical is the new realistic, right? And if you're not a radical today, you're very naive.
No, I mean, I think that's a nice way of closing utopia as the form of realism. And thank you very much to both of you for this conversation. Let's finish on this optimistic note. I think on climate change, yes, time is up, but CO2 reductions are happening at scale in one place, which is Europe. You said it before. And I'm saying this not because this is politically a point to score, but because indeed the reductions in Europe can show that it can be done. And I think we'll also, including in our twisted economic models, also have quite an impact on other players around the world. Late, no doubt, but I think quite strongly. So let's be optimistic on that front as well, and work together here in Japan and in Europe on this agenda. And I will continue with your help, Sohei, I will continue to look for the Greta Thunberg here, because I strongly believe that what we have seen in Europe with Greta Thunberg, which I call the Thunberg miracle, it needs to happen in other places, and with the limits and constraints which you have so well set out, also here in Japan. Thank you so much to both of you, and I can only warmly recommend reading these two amazing pieces of academic research, but also particularly well written. It's a real pleasure to read it. You will learn, and maybe you will change a little bit and be part of that change which is so necessary. So thank you very much to both of you for having kicked off the...
Thank you so much.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bregman, Mr. Saito, Ambassador. We did have a few questions coming in on the chat towards the end. I'm sorry we don't have time today to discuss them, but we will convey them to our two authors, and perhaps we might see if we can find a way to let everyone know. Thank you again. Another hand for our speakers today. I'd just like to mention that we start today with the European Literature Festival. This will go on for the entire week, from tomorrow to Sunday. There's a whole program of events. If you're in the room, you may have picked up some of these flyers. Otherwise, please look online, eulitfestjp. We have the information in English and Japanese of all the events. We also have with us today a few of our authors who are presenting in some of the sessions. If you're here today, would you like to come up or just introduce yourselves? I haven't managed to check, but I do see, who do I see? Please come up to the stage. Any of the speakers? Yes, thank you. Yes, of course, I see. Great. Thank you. No, we'll introduce her. So, I see. Okay, thank you. This is Ms. Marketa Pilatova, who will speak. Oh, please, why don't you join? Yes. Please come up on stage. Hello.
Hey, great for the accepting our invitation. Hello.
Ms. Takako Servo, from translator for Finnish literature.
I'm José from Portugal.
Mr. José Luís Peixoto, Portuguese author. And Ms. Yuki Nagae, poet and performer, who will be performing at the final session this year, on Sunday, 27th. Ms. Kamigori from the Danish embassy, who will also be speaking with our Danish author. And the two Italian gentlemen researchers who will be joining us, Mr. Giacomo Manzoli and Mr. Professor Doi. And Ms. Please, Mélis Bessery, a French author, novelist, who will also be presenting tomorrow. So we have, not everyone is here today. I think some people are still flying in the coming days, but we're very welcome for all of you to come see and listen to this very wide, diverse range of literary talent that we have in the festival. Thank you. So this is the end of the session. Please close the YouTube. 配信終了お願いします。And for those in the room, the buffet should be open. If you